Hey everyone, I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've been working at my dad's auto repair shop since I was 16. It's not the kind of place you see in flashy ads or on TV shows about cars. It's just a modest but steady business that's served our small town for decades. Over the years, I've put my sweat and soul into it, learning every part of the trade from my dad. For a long time, I thought the shop would eventually be mine. Growing up, my dad would talk about how proud he was of the work I was putting in and how he saw a lot of himself in me. One day, this will all be yours, he'd say, usually while pointing out some issue on a beat-up old truck we were fixing. Those words stuck with me. They were my motivation through the late nights, the long hours, and the weekends spent at the shop while my friends were out having fun. My older brother, on the other hand, has always had a different path. He's 32 now, and he's more into the tech world. He spent most of his adult life working on startups, chasing funding, and pitching app ideas. I don't think he's ever picked up a wrench in his life. To be honest, he's never shown any interest in the family business, and that's always been fine with me. He had his thing, I had mine. But recently, things have felt off. My dad's been talking about retiring sooner than expected. He's not sick or anything serious, but he's been hinting at wanting to slow down and enjoy life. It seemed like the perfect time for me to step up and take over. I even started making mental notes of what I'd change once I was in charge. Maybe update some of the equipment, expand our services, stuff like that. Then, I started noticing subtle shifts. My dad began spending more time with my brother. At first, I thought it was just family stuff. They've always been close in that way. But then, one of my coworkers mentioned something that stopped me in my tracks. My brother had been coming around the shop, asking questions about how things ran. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe he was just curious. But things got weirder. At a family dinner not too long ago, my dad started going on about how impressed he was with my brother's business acumen. He didn't say much more than that, but the way he looked at him during the conversation made my stomach sink. I asked my dad if something was going on, and he waved me off with a casual, "Don't worry about it. Everything's fine." A few days later, I walked into the shop like usual, but something was definitely not normal. My brother was there, standing in the middle of the shop with some accountant-looking guy, talking about plans to rebrand. Rebrand? The shop? My shop? I didn't even know what to say. I just froze there, listening as they threw around ideas like renaming the place and turning it into some kind of sleek, modernized repair chain. I confronted my dad later that day, trying to keep my cool. That's when he dropped the bomb. He decided to hand the shop over to my brother. He said it was for the best, and that my brother's business skills would take the place to new heights. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded him of all the years I'd put into the shop, but he just brushed it off, saying I'd always have a role there, maybe as a manager. My brother's reaction made it worse. He acted like it was no big deal, and even joked about how I'd be running the day-to-day stuff while he handled the important business decisions. I couldn't tell if he was clueless or just didn't care how much this was hurting me. When I talked to my mom about it, she admitted she thought the decision was unfair, but said she didn't want to get involved. She didn't want to cause a bigger divide in the family. That didn't help. I started to wonder if I had any legal ground to stand on. I mean, I've put in over a decade of work here. I wasn't just some employee clocking in and out. I've helped build this business. I spent the rest of that night scrolling Reddit, reading posts from people who'd been in similar situations. It was comforting in a way, but also infuriating. A lot of people seemed to think I might have a case, but others said it wasn't worth the fight if it would destroy my relationship with my family. I don't know. I feel stuck. Right now, I just need to figure out what my next move is. Do I let this go and accept whatever scraps they throw my way, or do I stand up for myself and risk losing everything? For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, but I've got a sinking feeling this is just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Update 1. After my last post, the response was overwhelming. Most people told me to fight for my rights and not let my dad and brother push me out of something I've dedicated over a decade of my life to. Some shared similar experiences, while others pointed out legal options I might not have thought about. It was a mix of support and practical advice that helped me see I wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. Encouraged by those comments, I decided it was time to confront my dad directly. I waited until things were calm at home and asked to sit down with him. I started by laying out everything I'd done for the shop, from the late nights to bringing in some of our biggest customers. I didn't raise my voice or get emotional, I just presented the facts. But when I finished, he didn't look guilty or regretful. He just sighed and said he was doing this because he thought it was the right decision for the family. He went on about how I'd always have a secure job at the shop and how my brother needed the stability because his tech ventures hadn't worked out. That part stung. I've worked my tail off for years, and my reward is a job under someone who hasn't even been involved in the business until now. It felt like my brother's failures were being used to justify taking something I'd earned. When I pressed him further, he got defensive, saying it wasn't personal and that I should trust him to make the best decision for everyone. Things took an uglier turn a few days later. I was in the break room at the shop, and I overheard my brother talking to someone on the phone. He was laughing, saying I was too emotional to run a business, and that this was just how things were. That one sentence felt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just indifferent, he thought this whole situation was funny. By this point, I knew I had to figure out where I stood legally. I reached out to a local lawyer for advice. After explaining the situation, they told me that while I didn't technically own the business, the years I'd spent helping it grow and my contributions to its success might give me a case for compensation. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. Meanwhile, my mom, who initially seemed like she didn't want to take sides, started showing more support. She told me she didn't agree with my dad's decision and thought I should stand up for myself. She even tried to talk to him privately, but it didn't seem to change his mind. My coworkers also had my back. When I told them what was happening, they were just as angry as I was. A couple of them even said they'd quit if my brother took over, especially since he had no experience in the industry. Hearing that gave me a boost of confidence. I wasn't the only one who thought this whole thing was unfair. Then came the family dinner. I wasn't planning to bring it up, but when my dad started talking about the exciting changes coming to the shop, I couldn't hold back. I called him out in front of everyone, asking why he thought it was okay to make promises to me for years, only to hand everything to my brother. My dad tried to brush it off, saying I was overreacting, but I didn't let up. My brother chimed in, saying I didn't understand the big picture and that I was being entitled. That was when I lost it. I told them both they were lying and manipulating me, and then I walked out. The next day, my lawyer suggested we take the first formal step, sending a letter outlining my contributions and demanding compensation for the years I'd worked without a formal agreement. It wasn't about money, it was about making it clear that I wouldn't just roll over and let them do this to me. My brother must have gotten wind of the letter because he texted me a few days later. He offered to make me a partner in the new setup, which based on his tone, sounded like a glorified management role with no real say in how things were run. I didn't even respond. I wasn't going to settle for scraps when I'd been promised the whole thing. The fallout didn't stop there. Word started spreading among extended family, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. Most people sided with me saying my dad was out of line for breaking his promise. A few tried to play peacemaker, but it felt like the damage was already done. I posted an update on Reddit, sharing everything that had happened since the first post. I asked for advice on whether to keep pushing legally, or if I should just walk away and cut ties with my family. The responses were just as supportive as before, with many encouraging me to keep fighting but warning me to prepare for the fallout. Right now, I'm trying to take things one step at a time. The next move is probably going to court, but I'll keep you all updated as things unfold. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Update 2. After my last update, things escalated faster than I expected. Encouraged by the support from Reddit and my coworkers, I officially filed a legal claim against my dad for unpaid labor and emotional damages. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt like I had no other choice. My lawyer assured me that I had a strong case, especially given the years of work I'd put into the business without a formal contract. When my dad found out about the lawsuit, he completely lost it. He started calling me ungrateful and accusing me of trying to destroy the family. He said I was overreacting and should have just accepted the situation like an adult. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. I didn't engage with him directly after that. My lawyer advised me to let all communication go through them, and I agreed. Surprisingly, my brother went radio silent during all of this. After the text about the so-called partnership, he didn't reach out again. I wasn't sure if he was staying quiet because he didn't want to get involved, or if he was just letting my dad take the heat. Either way, I wasn't complaining. Meanwhile, my coworkers stepped up in a big way. Several of them agreed to testify about how much I'd contributed to the shop over the years. One even mentioned that they remembered my dad publicly saying multiple times that I'd inherit the business one day. Having their support meant everything. It felt like validation for all the hard work I'd put in. As part of the legal process, my lawyer and I started digging through my old emails and documents to build a solid case. That's when I struck gold. I found emails from a few years ago where I'd been the main point of contact for securing some of our biggest clients. These weren't small deals either, they were contracts that brought in steady work and revenue for the shop. The emails clearly showed that I wasn't just another employee, I was an integral part of the business's success. My mom, who had been hesitant at first, started taking a stronger stand. She told my dad she wouldn't just sit by and let him treat me this way. In one heated argument, she even threatened to leave him if he didn't at least try to make amends. That was a turning point. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in the fight within my family. In the midst of all this, my extended family got involved. Someone decided it was a good idea to organize a family meeting to mediate the situation. I reluctantly agreed to attend, hoping it might lead to some sort of resolution. Spoiler, it didn't. The meeting quickly turned into a shouting match. My dad accused me of airing dirty laundry and disrespecting him. My brother jumped in, saying I was being selfish and couldn't see the bigger picture. I countered by laying out everything I'd done for the business and pointing out how my dad had broken his promise. It ended with my dad giving me an ultimatum: drop the legal claim or be cut off from the family. I left the meeting without looking back. As word spread around town about the lawsuit, I started noticing a shift in how people treated me. A lot of locals, especially our longtime clients, sided with me. They knew how much time I'd spent at the shop and how invested I was in its success. Some even told me they'd stop bringing their cars there if my brother stayed in charge. It was bittersweet to hear, but it showed me I wasn't alone. Then I learned something that put things into perspective. One of my cousins, who's closer to my brother than I am, let it slip that his tech ventures had been failing for years. Apparently he was deep in debt, and taking over the shop was supposed to be his lifeline. That explained a lot about my dad's decision. It didn't make it right, but it helped me understand why he'd thrown me under the bus. Eventually, the case moved forward, and a court date was set. My dad must have realized how serious I was because he tried to settle out of court. The offer was laughable, barely enough to cover a year's worth of my work, let alone the decade I'd put in. I rejected it without hesitation. The tension within the family kept building. Relatives started pressuring my dad to make things right with me. They pointed out how unfair he'd been and how much damage this was causing to our relationships. Some even stopped speaking to him altogether. It was chaos, but I stayed focused on the case. I updated Reddit with everything that had happened so far. The support and encouragement kept me going. People shared stories about similar fights they'd been through and told me I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. I don't know what the outcome will be, but one thing's for sure, I'm not backing down. The court date is set, and I'll keep you all posted as things progress. This fight isn't over yet. Update 3. The court date finally arrived, and walking into that courtroom felt surreal. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I had my lawyer by my side, along with a few of my coworkers who had agreed to testify. The courtroom wasn't packed, but I noticed a few familiar faces from the community who had come to show their support. My mom was there too, sitting quietly in the back. My dad and brother were on the other side of the room, avoiding eye contact with me. The proceedings started with opening statements. My lawyer laid out the case, years of unpaid labor, verbal promises made by my dad, and my significant contributions to the success of the business. My dad's lawyer argued that I was just an employee and that my dad had the right to give the business to whoever he wanted. It was hard not to react, but I stayed calm. Then came the testimonies. My brother was the first to take the stand. He claimed the decision to give him the business was purely financial, painting himself as the more capable person to modernize and expand the shop. He downplayed my role, saying I'd been there just doing routine work and wasn't involved in any major business decisions. Hearing him talk like that was infuriating, but it wasn't unexpected. Next, it was time for my coworkers to testify. One by one, they described the reality of what went on at the shop. They talked about how I was the one who handled client negotiations, managed the day-to-day operations, and even trained new employees. One coworker, who'd been with the shop for almost as long as I had, mentioned that my dad often referred to me as his right-hand man and talked about handing the shop over to me someday. Their words painted a clear picture of how much I'd contributed, and it felt like the tide was turning in my favor. When it was my dad's turn to testify, he stuck to the argument that I was just an employee. He said he'd never formally promised the shop to me, and that any discussions about it were just casual conversations. He seemed nervous, stumbling over his words at times, especially when questioned about why he never put anything in writing. My lawyer pressed him on why my brother, who had no experience in the industry, was suddenly the best choice to run the business. My dad tried to justify it by saying he believed in my brother's business skills, but the reasoning felt weak. Then it was my turn. I presented the emails and documents my lawyer and I had gathered, showing how I'd been instrumental in bringing in major clients and ensuring the shop's success. The judge seemed to pay close attention as I explained my role, using specific examples of deals I'd negotiated and problems I'd solved. My lawyer asked me to talk about the conversations I'd had with my dad over the years, where he'd promised the shop would be mine. I answered honestly, laying out the timeline and details. The most unexpected moment came when my mom was called to testify. I hadn't been sure if she'd actually go through with it, but when she took the stand, she didn't hold back. She confirmed that my dad had repeatedly told her and other family members that the shop would go to me. She also said she believed I was the one who truly cared about the business and had earned the right to run it. My dad looked visibly shocked, and my brother wouldn't even look at her. Things took another turn when my lawyer presented evidence of my brother's mismanagement. It came out that in the few months he'd been running the shop, he'd already mishandled funds, lost a couple of key clients, and even made decisions that led to delays in projects. My dad's lawyer tried to downplay it, but the damage was done. It was clear that my brother wasn't the savior of the business my dad had made him out to be. During a break, my dad's lawyer approached mine with a new settlement offer. It was significantly higher than the first one, but I still rejected it. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about accountability and standing up for myself. As the case went on, more locals started showing up in court. Their presence was a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. Seeing them there gave me a boost of confidence. The most dramatic moment came when my brother, clearly frustrated, had a meltdown during cross-examination. He accused me of trying to ruin his life and said I'd never be satisfied no matter what I got. His outburst didn't do him any favors, it only made him look petty and unprofessional. Finally, both sides presented their closing arguments. My lawyer emphasized my years of dedication and the promises that had been made, while my dad's lawyer tried to paint me as someone who was bitter and entitled. The judge announced that the verdict would be delivered in a few weeks, and the case was adjourned. As I left the courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions, but I knew I'd done everything I could to make my case. I posted an update on Reddit to thank everyone for their support and let them know how the day had gone. Now, all I can do is wait and see what the judge decides. No matter what happens, I'm proud that I stood up for myself. This fight isn't over yet. Update 4. The day of the verdict arrived and the courtroom was packed. My lawyer told me to stay calm no matter the outcome, but my hands felt like they were glued to the edge of the table. The judge took their time summarizing the arguments before delivering the decision. When they finally ruled in my favor, it was like time slowed down. The court awarded me significant compensation for my years of contributions to the shop. It wasn't ownership of the business, but it was a clear acknowledgement of the promises my dad had made and broken. As the judge finished speaking, my brother stormed out of the courtroom. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just grabbed his things and left. My dad stayed seated, looking stunned. After a few minutes, he came over to me and muttered an apology. It felt hollow, like he was saying it because he thought he had to, not because he truly meant it. I nodded politely but didn't engage. At that point, I wasn't interested in making amends. Too much had happened. Word of the verdict spread quickly in our small town, and it didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The shop started losing clients almost immediately. People didn't trust my brother to run the place, especially after the court proceedings revealed how poorly he'd managed things in just a few months. Longtime clients began taking their cars elsewhere, and my old coworkers weren't sticking around to watch the ship sink. One by one, they quit, citing the chaos and incompetence under my brother's leadership. At home, things weren't much better for my parents. My mom had been quietly supporting me throughout the case, but after the verdict, she reached her breaking point. She packed her bags and moved out, telling my dad she couldn't stay with someone who would treat their own child the way he had treated me. She came to stay with me for a while, and though things were tense, it was comforting to have her support. With the compensation money and the encouragement of my former coworkers, I decided it was time to start fresh. I announced that I was opening my own auto repair shop, and a few of my most trusted former coworkers immediately signed on to join me. It wasn't easy finding a location and getting everything set up, but the community rallied behind me. Locals started spreading the word, and before we'd even officially opened, we already had a list of clients ready to bring their cars in. Meanwhile, my dad started showing signs of regret. A cousin of mine told me he'd admitted privately that giving the business to my brother was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. It was too late, though. The damage was done, and I wasn't looking for reconciliation. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to spiral further. Without the shop bringing in consistent revenue, he couldn't keep up with his debts. He had to sell off some of his personal assets, and eventually the business shut down completely. The family was more divided than ever. Some relatives tried to pressure me into forgiving my dad and brother, saying that family is more important than money. I told them I wasn't holding a grudge, but I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine either. I decided to keep my distance, focusing on the new chapter 1 was building for myself. My mom, on the other hand, became my biggest cheerleader. She helped with everything from paperwork to decorating the new shop, and she even brought in some of her friends as our first clients. Seeing her support meant more to me than I could ever put into words. We started rebuilding our relationship, and I finally felt like I had someone in my corner. When the shop officially opened, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. We had a small ribbon-cutting ceremony, and some of our loyal clients from the old shop showed up to celebrate. I shared photos on Reddit, and the response was incredible. People from all over sent messages of support, saying how inspired they were by the journey I'd been through. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. The betrayal from my dad and brother was devastating, but it pushed me to build something even better. Starting my own business wasn't part of the original plan, but it's given me a sense of independence and pride I wouldn't trade for anything. I owe a huge thanks to everyone who supported me through this, from my coworkers and community to the people on Reddit who kept me going when things felt hopeless. This fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the people you trust the most will let you down. down, but that doesn't mean you can't pick yourself up and move forward. I'm excited to see where this new chapter takes me, and I'll always be grateful for the lessons this journey taught me. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this ride. I couldn't have done it without you. Update 5. Since opening my own shop, things have been moving fast. The grand opening turned out to be just the start of something much bigger than I expected. Within weeks, we were busy every single day. Loyal clients from the old shop kept coming back, and word of mouth brought in new customers who were eager to support a local business. We even had a few people tell us they came in because they'd read my story online. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. Then something unexpected happened. A former client from the old shop, someone I'd worked with closely for years, stopped by. After catching up and seeing how well the new business was running, they made me an offer. They wanted to invest in my shop to help us expand, offering not just financial backing but also connections to suppliers and equipment upgrades. It was a huge opportunity, and we started discussing plans almost immediately. Meanwhile, I started hearing more about my brother's struggles. His financial troubles had only gotten worse since the old shop shut down. He'd been forced to sell off his car and other personal assets, and I learned through a mutual acquaintance that he was living with my dad. The situation didn't surprise me, but it was still strange to think about how quickly things had unraveled for him. Out of the blue, I got an email from my dad. It was long, almost like he didn't know how to get to the point. He apologized for everything that had happened, said he regretted the decisions he'd made, and asked if there was any way we could repair our relationship. I didn't know how to respond right away. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready to let him back into my life either. Eventually, I sent a short reply thanking him for the apology and explaining that I needed time before considering any kind of reconciliation. Not long after, a local news outlet contacted me. They'd heard about my story from a client and wanted to feature my shop in an article. When the piece came out, it was titled something like "From Betrayal to Business Owner, the Face of Resilience." It was surreal seeing my name and photo in print, and it brought in even more customers. The community support has been overwhelming in the best way. Then, my mom shared some news about my brother. She told me he'd had a complete breakdown, both financially and emotionally. He wasn't working, and my dad was now supporting him completely. I didn't know how to process it at first. I wasn't happy about it, but I couldn't say I was shocked either. My mom seemed worried about him, but she was also careful not to push me to reach out. The real curveball came when my dad showed up at my shop unannounced. He looked tired, older than I remembered. He started talking about how proud he was of what I'd accomplished and how sorry he was for everything. Then he made me an offer. He wanted to help me expand the shop, financially, logistically, however I needed. It sounded like his way of making up for the past, but I wasn't sure if I could trust him. My mom later told me she thought I should consider it, but warned me to make sure I stayed in control of my business. Before making any decisions, I consulted my lawyer. We discussed what an agreement with my dad might look like and how to structure it to protect my independence. The lawyer advised me to be cautious and suggested drafting a detailed contract if I decided to move forward. I appreciated the advice, but I still wasn't sure what to do. Around this time, one of my former coworkers who'd stayed at the old shop reached out to me. They shared details about how poorly my brother had run things before the business collapsed. It wasn't just bad decisions, it was sheer negligence. Hearing it all laid out made me feel a little better about how things had played out. At least I wasn't the reason the shop failed. Then came the biggest surprise. My brother texted me. He said he was desperate for work and asked if I'd consider hiring him as a mechanic. I didn't know what to think. On one hand, I knew how much he'd hurt me, but on the other, I couldn't ignore the fact that he was struggling. It was a lot to process, and I needed time to figure out what the right move was. In the end, I decided to meet with both my dad and my brother. We arranged to sit down in a neutral setting, a local coffee shop. I told them I was willing to hear them out, but I also made it clear that things wouldn't go back to how they were. Trust had to be earned, and boundaries had to be respected. My dad repeated his offer to help with the business, and my brother asked again for a job, saying he just needed a chance to start over. I haven't made any final decisions yet, but I'm leaning towards setting strict terms if I agree to anything. This is my business, my future, and I'm not going to let anyone jeopardize it again. I'll keep you all updated as things develop. For now, I'm just focused on keeping the momentum going and making the most of this new chapter in my life.